Okay, so we're diving straight in today, and it's all about those daily routines, how we talk about them in English, the stuff of everyday life.
Right, the nitty-gritty.
Exactly. And you've given us some great material to work with here, this talking about your daily routine in English. It's got it all, doesn't it? Work schedules, what we do when we're not working, how we eat, even how we sleep.
It's a real deep dive into those everyday rhythms.
And that's exactly our mission today, to really tease out the language, the practical phrases, and just get a sense of how diverse our daily lives can actually be.
Absolutely. So whether you want to up your English conversation game, or maybe you're just interested in how different people structure their day, or even if you're looking for some new vocabulary, this one's for you.
It really is. And we promise, no dry grammar lectures here. We're going to keep it lively, relatable, and hopefully you'll have a few aha moments along the way. Because I think what's fascinating about these sources is how they show us both the perks and the pitfalls of different routines. We're going to see the person who's got that, freelance freedom, setting their own hours, working from home.
The dream for many.
Right. But then we'll also hear from someone who's got that more traditional 9 to 5, navigating that fixed schedule. So let's get started, shall we? Working routines, that seems like the logical place to begin.
It does, and the dialogue we have here gives us a great comparison between working from home, that whole freelance life, and then the experience of being in an office.
And what really jumps out for me is this idea of freedom that comes with freelancing, right? You set your own hours, you can maybe squeeze in a longer lunch break to hit the gym, all that.
But it's not all rosy, is it?
No, no, not at all. And that's where it gets really interesting, because the freelancer in the dialogue specifically mentions the need to be disciplined,
Yeah.
to really stick to a schedule, even when you're the one setting it.
It's that classic thing, isn't it? Flexibility can be both a blessing and a curse.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that a lot of people new to working from home or maybe thinking about going freelance don't always realize. You need that structure, that self-discipline. It doesn't just magically happen because you're not in an office.
And that's a really key point to get across when you're talking about this kind of lifestyle in English, too.
Totally. And then on the flip side, we have the person with the traditional job who paints a very clear picture of the constraints. Waking up early, commuting for an hour, they have to leave the house by 6:30 at the latest, and they don't get back until 7 at the earliest, so a huge chunk of the day is just gone.
Right, and they even say they don't miss the commute at all.
Oh yeah, calling it a sucky experience.
Very relatable for many, I'd say.
Oh, absolutely. And the dialogue gives us some really useful phrases for talking about work schedules in general. You hear things like, I start work at, and I finish at.
And then there's that very real possibility of often having to stay late if there's something I need to finish, which is a classic office scenario.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting to contrast that with the freelancers. I take a long lunch break because for the office worker, it's likely to be only a short lunch break if they want to get home at a reasonable time. And those little details, like at the earliest and at the latest, they add so much precision, don't they?
They do. I mean, when the office worker says they don't get home until 7 at the earliest, you know it could be even later.
Exactly. And then the words like often and usually, these are what we call adverbs of frequency, they tell us how often something happens. They give us even more detail about how regular these things are.
Right. So it's not just about the specific times, it's also about how reliably, how frequently these events happen in our daily lives. And those adverbs are key for building that picture.
They are. They are. So I want you, the listener, to think about your own working day for a moment. What resonates with you more? That flexible freelance approach or the more structured office life? And the source actually gives you some direct questions to ask yourself. Like, what's your working day like? What time do you start and finish?
Good prompts for thinking about your own routine.
Exactly. And some great phrases you could use are, I start work at 9 and I finish at 5, if you've got that fixed schedule. Or if it's more fluid, you might say, I'm a freelancer, so I work different hours every day. It really depends what I have to do.
And this brings up an interesting point, even for those with flexible schedules. What kind of self-discipline do you need to make it work?
Oh, that's such a good question.
Yeah.
And for those in more professional roles, where are the non-negotiables in your schedule? And where do you find those little pockets of flexibility? Okay, let's move on to what happens after work, because that's when things get really interesting.
It is. And the source gives us two very contrasting approaches to free time, doesn't it?
It does. We've got the person who, after a long day, is just wiped out. They say they crash on the sofa and watch TV. They even admit they don't really enjoy it, but they're just too tired to do anything else.
Apart from playing tennis once a week, they squeeze that in.
They do, which is good.
Yeah.
But I think we can all relate to that feeling of just wanting to collapse after work.
Absolutely. But then in contrast, we have the person who's desperate to get out of the house after being cooped up all day.
Right. They need that energy, that social interaction. They're going to boxing class twice a week, playing basketball with friends.
And they generally like to go out for coffee or drinks a couple of evenings as well. It's quite the opposite end of the spectrum.
It really is. And I think what's fascinating here is how those preferences shape their routines. You know, one person's prioritizing rest and just passive entertainment because they're drained. The other's actively seeking out engagement to counteract that feeling of being stuck at home.
It shows how individual needs and energy levels really drive our choices, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And the source gives us some great phrases to describe those different activity levels. If you're more on the active side, you might say, I like to get out of the house when I can.
Or even, I try to arrange something most evenings, or I prefer to stay busy.
Exactly. And if you're more in that relaxation camp, there are phrases like, I don't have the energy to do much after work, or I just crash on the sofa and watch TV when I get home. Those really capture that need to unwind.
And once again, those adverbs of frequency often, generally, sometimes, occasionally, and those time phrases like once a week, on Wednesdays, every Friday, they're crucial for adding detail.
They are because they tell us how often these activities actually take place. And that gives us a much clearer picture of someone's routine, their rhythm.
It's all about painting a picture, isn't it?
It is. So for you listening, which of these approaches feels more familiar? Are you an evening wind-down person or an on-the-go type?
And think about why that is. Is it purely about energy levels, or are there other factors like your need to connect with people, pursue hobbies?
Really good questions. Okay, let's move on to something we all have to deal with, those meal habits. And again, the source contrasts someone whose meal habits are all over the place with someone who's much more structured.
Yeah, that phrase all over the place is brilliant, isn't it? You immediately get a sense of lack of regularity.
You do. And they go on to say they sometimes skip meals or eat at weird times. Dinner could be anywhere between like 7:30 and 11 at night.
It's a very go with the flow or maybe even chaotic approach driven by hunger and whatever else is going on in their day.
Which is the complete opposite of the other person who has to eat at the same time every day. And the reason is their work schedule, they just don't have much flexibility.
So it shows how external factors can dictate something as basic as when we eat.
They really can. And then the discussion about lunch is interesting, too. We've got the person who's organized enough to cook at the weekends and bring a packed lunch or food with me to work, as they put it.
Versus just grabbing a sandwich or something from a bakery, which is definitely more convenient.
It is. It's that classic trade-off between effort and ease. And for the evening meal, they mentioned taking turns cooking, which is a good system if you're living with someone.
And then there's that almost ritualistic takeaway on Friday evening, which I'm sure many of us can relate to.
Oh, totally. A nice way to end the week.
Yeah.
And for the person living alone, they talk about the motivation struggle, finding it hard to cook just for themselves.
So they cook a big batch of something at the weekend to freeze and have throughout the week.
Smart strategy. And there's some really useful phrases in this section, all over the place, to describe those irregular habits.
Skip meals for when you miss a meal altogether.
And then cook a big batch for making a large quantity of food. All very practical, everyday English.
And the source actually asks you some direct questions. Do you sometimes skip meals? Do you buy lunch or cook at home? Do you ever get takeaways?
It's really prompting you to think about your own habits
Yeah.
and how you describe them using this vocabulary.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting here how cultural norms also play a role in our eating habits. I mean, this source focuses on individual routines, but in many cultures, mealtimes are very social events with a lot of structure around them.
Absolutely. Okay, let's wrap up with the all-important topic of sleep because it impacts everything else, doesn't it?
It does. And the source introduces those two familiar categories, the morning person and the night owl.
Classic, right? And I'm curious, which one do you consider yourself to be?
Well, the dialogue gives us both. We've got the person who says, I'm not a morning person either, but they like to get stuff done early for that sense of productivity.
And they actually mentioned taking a nap in the afternoon after staying up late, which is interesting.
It is. And then we have the self-proclaimed total night owl, who even expresses a bit of envy for the freelancer who can start work later.
It's funny how strongly people identify with one or the other. And then there's that discussion about needing 7 or 8 hours of sleep to function properly.
It's something we all know, but it's good to be reminded of. Sleep is crucial.
Absolutely. And we get some great phrases here. I really struggle to get moving in the morning.
Oh, yeah, that one's very relatable.
It is. And then there's, I stay up late on weekends. A classic.
And sometimes I take a nap in the afternoon for those who need a little midday boost.
And the source helpfully explains those phrases too, which is really useful for English language learners. Struggle to get moving means finding it difficult to wake up because you're tired.
Stay up late simply means going to bed at a late hour.
And take a nap is having a short sleep during the day. Very clear and practical.
And then the source throws the question back to you, the listener. What time do you usually wake up and go to sleep? Do you find it easy to get going in the morning? How much sleep do you need to feel rested?
It's a good opportunity to use that new vocabulary to describe your sleep habits.
It is, and it's also worth remembering that these preferences can change over time depending on things like work schedules and lifestyle.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So, are you someone who springs out of bed at the crack of dawn, or do you prefer to burn the midnight oil?
And do you usually manage to get those 7 or 8 hours? Something to think about.
It is. It is. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into daily routines. We've covered a lot of ground here.
We have, from work and leisure to eating habits and sleep, all based on that great material you shared, talking about your daily routine in English.
And hopefully you've picked up some useful vocabulary and gained some insights into how different people structure their lives.
Absolutely. And as we finish up, think about how understanding these expressions not only helps you communicate in English, but also encourages you to reflect on your own daily routine.
Does it work for you?
Exactly. Maybe there's a small change inspired by some of the routines we've discussed that you could experiment with. It's food for thought, as they say.
It really is. Thanks for joining us. Until next time.